This seminar is organized by JMABC, the Jewish Medical Association of BC. I am Larry Barzilai, co-chair of the JMABC. The seminar is scheduled to last 1 hour. The two presenters will be speaking for about 40 minutes. This will be followed by a Q&A session of 20 minutes. Please mute yourself at all times. You can write your questions in the chat. Alternatively, at the end of the presentation, you can raise your hand, be recognized, and ask questions directly. Please keep your questions short and make them questions rather than statements. Lilach Marom is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Education at Simon Fraser University. I first met Lilach when she and her family crashed in the basement of our house when they arrived from Israel. Her research draws on critical theories to highlight issues of equality, anti-racism, and inclusion in education. It focuses on structural and institutional barriers to success in higher education. A couple of her recent publications include Common Misconceptions of Disabled Students and Covert Racism in Teacher Education. Ania Switzer is a UBC lecturer and a historical political sociologist. Her education involves studies at Jagiellonian University in Poland, the Leo Baeck Institute in London, and the Shoah Foundation Institute at the University of Southern California. In addition to her work in the field of Jewish studies and Holocaust education, her areas of specialization include nationalism, post-war Europe, and production of knowledge and memory. DEI has become part of the university fabric of the Western world. According to a U.S. report issued today, the U.S. Department of Education has spent over $1 billion in grants at advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion in hiring, programming, and mental health training in America's schools in the last 3 years. But is it good for the Jews? I'm pleased to present to you Doctors Lilach Marom and Ania Switzer.
Thank you. Thank you for this introduction.
Okay, should we start?
Please go.
Okay, so thanks for having us, and I just want to start in a good way and say that I'm joining you from...
So it's blocked. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, okay. That I'm joining you from my home in Burnaby, which is on the unceded and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Coquitlam Nation. Ania is in Vancouver on the land of the Musqueam people. And thinking about land, for me, is a way to think about how we live in reciprocity and good relations. And when I think about the history of the place here and the history of the place I grew up in, Israel, or some people call it Palestine. So I'm thinking about how can we live together? How can we acknowledge the truth and in its complexity? And how can we aim to reconcile and to live together in good relations? And, you know, again, growing up in Israel, Palestine, I wish peace and reciprocity to all who suffer there. And so is EDI good for the Jews is a kind of a provocative title, Larry insisted. I don't know if we'll answer this, but we'll try to unpack how EDI can be a better framing to live together in good relations. So Ania. Oh, where is we need to also, just before we start.
Yes, we would love to acknowledge our generous supporters and acknowledge their faith in this project and just unquestioning support that they've offered, beginning with Professor Greg Gardner at UBC, the Diamond Chair in Jewish Law and Ethics, whose sharing of his research funding enabled us to start this project. And then thanks to also the support of the Jewish Federation of the Greater Vancouver and their connections with the Rothberg Foundation. The foundation enabled us to move forward and expand this project. And today's presentation is based on the first paper that resulted from this project that has been finalized and submitted for publication. And so we're awaiting reviews. But this is a multi-stage project, and we'll conclude this presentation today with telling you a bit more about what's coming up next.
Okay, so overall, we're just, you can see here what we hope to do. So just to talk a bit about this first stage of the project, and we'll leave some time for discussions and questions at the end. So really our research questions in this whole project was, are Jews and anti-Semitism considered in the existing EDI framework? And EDI stands for Equity, Diversity, Inclusion in higher education, and in what ways do the current EDI policies and plans include anti-Semitism and Jewish identity? And so this first part of the project was really about unpacking policies and looking how they construct and frame Jewish identity and anti-Semitism.
So I'll begin by telling you briefly about terminology applied throughout this research project. We begin with the premise that language matters. The words that we use matters. The words that we use construct, create reality among us, to create a reality we'll live in. And that's why we're looking at those policies. You'll see this in depth, how we do it and what are results. But we operate from the premise that what is being said and how in this case Jewishness and anti-Semitism are presented or conveyed or are talked about in the existing policies. Then it affects how it affects and shapes the Jewish lived experience. And so I'll just explain to begin with why we're not using the IRA definition of anti-Semitism throughout this research, and what we're trying to do instead. The IRA definition, although widely accepted by the mainstream Jewish institutions and political institutions across Canada, became politicized to the extent that is not very useful, and it's difficult to apply, and it's difficult to distinguish from otherwise legitimate criticism of Zionism as an ideology, or and that how this criticism also sometimes overlaps with the criticism of the state of Israel. And that leads us, there are competing definitions of anti-Semitism. But when we look at anti-Semitism itself as a social phenomenon, it's a dynamic creature, right? It's in its basic understanding, it's a prejudice and hostility against Jews as Jews, but also from a social science perspective, it's a theory, it's a tool, it's a framework. It helps to explain how the world works, how it can be organized, how it can be changed. It's a way of thinking, making sense of the world, and it's dynamic. It changes, right? Those anti-Semitic tropes evolve constantly and mutate and adapt to the current context. So any single definitions would necessarily constrain our research and our understanding, and would be unhelpful. So we adopt this basic understanding of anti-Semitism as prejudice, and acknowledge its dynamic nature. When it comes to Jewish people, we note the diversity of identities, diversities of the Jewish practice beyond mere religious affiliations or religious practice, on which a bit later. And again, just in bare bones understanding of Zionism that we adopt, as you can see, very, very, very basic, and that's the deliberate choice to just limit ourselves to the right of Jews to a national self-determination in some portion of the historic homeland. With that, we also acknowledge that the lived experience, the fact that Zionism is not some sort of agreed upon concept, and it has multiple strands and multiple interpretations, which probably won't surprise you, within Jewish communities inside and outside of Israel. With that, we also want to acknowledge that majority of Canadian Jews feel deep ties with the state of Israel. And again, many experience exclusion based on the be it real or perceived ties with that state. Thank you.
Thank you. So we use the theoretical framework. We work within the EDI framework. So just a quick overview. So EDI, and again, stands for equity, diversity, inclusion. Sometimes there is an additional I or D standing for indigeneity, indigenation, and decolonization. And this has become the leading framework within Canadian society and Canadian higher education institution to address issues of historical injustice, oppression, marginalization. You can see here in the chart that most Canadian universities have adopted EDI as part of their mission statement, institutional planning, have task force who incorporated EDI policies, right? So rather, some people, we live in a very tense time, and there are a lot of controversies, and some people, call to dismantle EDI altogether. So our approach is in a way twofolded. One, it is here, and it is very prevalent in Canadian higher education institution in general. So strategically, I don't think this is the way to go. Kind of like trying to dismantle this framework. But even deeper than that, we work within the EDI framework, assuming that issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion are important, that our society and institutions can be better. When it's come to higher education institution, it's about unpacking issues of how can we include as many people from multiple backgrounds, how can we create welcoming environment, how can we acknowledge our differences, and how can we really have our institution welcoming spaces for people from diverse background and positioning. So those are good things, but we look in a critical way at those critical lenses to ask how can they become better, more inclusive, more welcoming, and maybe what are some of the omissions or critique that we can apply to those frames. And so I will just say here that the lineage of EDI is twofolded. It is, it kind of like is built on top of the Canadian Equity Employment Act, which recognize 4 groups: women, disabled people, what in the policy and language called visible minorities, so racialized groups, and indigenous people. So you can see already here that it is hard to include Jewish people under those 4 categories. And the other lineage is really the lineage of critical theories and this critical analysis of institutions, not as neutral spaces, but as societal places in which you want to look at issues of access and success and kind of like critically address the social and historical underpinning of societal institutions, right? So this is kind of like the big framing of EDI, and we work within it, but are critical toward it at the same time.
Yeah, with this acknowledgement that EDI does not necessarily need to be, there is a lot of criticism, but it doesn't need to be thrown out of the window entirely, because there is a lot of value in it. And we want to think how we can, what kind of recommendations can we issue? How can we examine how it works currently to make it work better, to serve those values that it professes to further. And we agree with those values of equality, diversity, and inclusion. And we look at the specific context of what happened in Canada post October sevens that we, I guess, all on this call have heard or experienced or are familiar with the reports on the surge of anti-Semitic incidents post-October. Then the question for scholars arises, obviously, what counts as a legitimate, as the actual anti-Semitism, not weaponized anti-Semitism. What is an expression of discontent and disillusionment and criticism of the state of Israel? We want to put that. We want to put those considerations aside. What we look at is like also what the robust, rigorous methodology research with rigorous methodologies show. Data such as Robert Brim's survey of Canadian institutions of higher education, also because of the importance of higher education institutions in setting the tone and shaping public debate. So what is happening around Jews and Israel? Brim concluded that there is generally no increase in anti-Semitic attitudes across overall Canadian population, with some exceptions. Universities featuring prominently among them as university campuses, academia as kind of hotspots where anti-Semitism is prominently on display, where there is antagonism, and that demands our attention and examination.
Sorry, I'm jumping
Okay.
here. Sorry, I lost control over it. Oh, okay. So methodology. So very briefly, so there's 2 stages in this project. We're going to share now the phase 1, which is policy analysis, in which we look at the construction of Jewish people and anti-Semitism in EDI policies of 28 universities. I'll tell you a bit more in a minute. And the second stage, we're going to have a survey and interviews, talking with people, academics, staff, and faculty about their experiences with anti-Semitism, Jewish identity through EDI. And again, we'll talk about it at the end, and hopefully some of you might be willing to participate. So the first stage in the methodology, we did policy and document analysis, 28 universities and 38 documents, and the inclusion criteria was Canadian research universities of 15,000 students or more. In some cases, we did include smaller universities because we wanted to have representation from across Canada. And we looked at, the second inclusion criteria was that those universities have certain type of EDI documents and policies. And by that, we mean either EDI general policies or institutional vision, or EDI research guideline. EDI research guideline became inherent part of the Canadian Research Chair program, which means that all universities that have CRCs, Canada Research Chairs, have to have some kind of document talking about EDI in research. So we either look at those documents or general EDI policies. And we did 2 forms of analysis. One quantitative, in which we look at the frequency of certain terms. You can see here the terms, and Ania would explain in a minute. And then we also did qualitative analysis. So we did content analysis of those paragraphs and places in which those terms were included.
So in that first stage, we simply count, right? When those terms that were on the previous slide, where they are mentioned. And so we find that only in the 6 documents, the term Jewish or Judaism are mentioned, and 6 refer to anti-Semitism in those EDI. 6 documents refer to anti-Semitism. So what we can conclude with that is that this mention is minimal or barely existing, and so then we were not able to come up. You cannot identify any meaningful patterns of speech. because of this is just negligent. Now, we also include here for reference the mentions of terms such as anti-indigenous races and anti-Black races, not to create some sort of competition, but because those are linchpins. This is unquestionably a center point of existing EDI policies. So to have an understanding, like if something is treated, is taken as a prominent position, how often those terms are being used. And then also we found that during this initial stage that terms related to Jewishness appeared when they did, infrequently as they did, in close proximity to the mention of the term Islamophobia, which was also infrequently mentioned. But when anti-Semitism appears, it's in proximity with Islamophobia. So again, we don't want to create some sort of a shouting match and competition, but we decided to expand our search and include the terms Islamophobia, Muslim, and Arab, so that we can better understand this discursive landscape, which means in plain English that we want to see what kind of meaning of anti-Semitism and Jewishness these documents convey. How do they? What kind of understanding of those terms? So how Jewishness, Judaism, and anti-Semitism, what kind of understanding emerges from those documents?
Thank you. Okay, so the qualitative analysis. So what we did then was to look at those places in which anti-Semitism or Jewish identity were included, and we kind of we coded, and we did thematic coding. So we tried to look at what meaning emerges from the places in which those words were used, and so it is interesting because there are so few references, which makes it almost anecdotal. And yet we could clearly see, even with this, kind of limited references, you can still see patterns. And those are the three patterns that we've identified: marginalization of anti-Semitism, Jewishness as religious identity, and the coupling of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. So I'm going to talk a bit about each of them. So the first one is really just the marginalization of anti-Semitism. So in most cases in which anti-Semitism was mentioned in the documents, and we're talking about EDI documents, sometimes they're 20, 30, 50 pages. It's really within the long list of isms. So it would be, our university stand against ism, anti-Semitism, ism. That's it. So really no other references, or no reference to anti-Semitism in a more profound way, but rather as part of this long list of isms. And it is even, I think, more interesting because a lot of those EDI policies, and I talked a bit about it before, they take critical lens, right? And so critical lens is about unpacking, deconstructing. It's about, looking and trying to look for deeper meaning, right? So if I'm going to do the same thing here, so look at this example, right? And this is from University of Manitoba. So the overwhelming positioning, experiences, views, and values embedded within our institutions are male, white, Eurocentric, Christian, able-bodied, rational, affluent, and heterosexual. This has led to the institutional and systemic underrepresentation, marginalization, discrimination, and othering that has resulted in ism, anti-Semitism, right? So if you look at those first part of the paragraph, it is a very clear critical language. It say, okay, we want to look at this underlying and systemic experiences of marginalization. We want to see how they are structurally and institutionally underlying our institution, and we want to dismantle them. But then when it came to anti-Semitism, there's complete lack of unpacking and using the same tools. How is anti-Semitism being constructed? In what way this is historical force, how it is changing, shifting. None of it is done when it comes to anti-Semitism. The second theme is Jewishness as a religious identity. So here again, when we talk about how universities construct Jewishness, in overwhelmingly majority, I think in 100% of the cases, Jewishness is only seen as a form of religious identity. So you can see here from 2 universities, the only references to Judaism was within the category of religious affiliation, of spiritual affiliation, no other references to Jewishness as a form of culture, race, ethnicity. Also, no references to Jewishness as an intersecting identity. So, for example, queer Jewish people, LGBTQ+, racialized Jews. So really, it's almost this a centralized understanding of being Jewish as a form of religious identity that is sealed. It's only within this bubble of religious. It's not intersectional, and it's not diverse. It's not seen through multiple ways of self-identifying as a Jew, but within this religious box. And again, although this is very anecdotal, but I think it is still telling. So I'm telling this. If you look at this example at the bottom, so you see this example from Queen's University, and you see here that they say that and this is within the context of multi-faith center. So they say within the university environment to facilitate welcoming, peaceful and safe spaces for trans, Muslim, indigenous, and other equity-seeking students, faculty, and staff, right? And this is within the context of faith and spiritual spaces, right? So you can see that whereas, for example, Muslim identity is seen as intersectional with trans and indigenous, Jewish is missing here, right? So there is, and this points again to some of those hidden tensions of seen as Jews as white, privilege, and not intersecting with any form of other marginalization or a group that were excluded, right? And the last point is the coupling of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And so again, this was very interesting that almost every time that you see anti-Semitism, immediately after you have Islamophobia. And both of them, by the way, are under-theorized and on the margins. And like Ania said, we have no interest in positioning them and pitting them against each other. And I think both phenomena are important to unpack and understand. But those phenomena not necessarily tie into each other, and they are not a reflection of each other. So I think this positioning, though, is not accidental and it's not incidental. It really talks about this political arena. And oftentimes we see a rise in both Islamophobia and anti-Semitism with relation to geopolitical tensions and political tensions. So I think it really points out to the fact that university administration try to really, be as careful as possible and are being approached by many groups from many directions, asking for different calls to address those issues. And so there is this carefulness in even when you just say one term, one of those two, immediately you point to the other. This is the same, we see it all around, right? When there is an anti-Semitism task force, immediately there'll be Islamophobia task force. And again, I'm not saying that this is not important, but I'm just saying that it's not coincidental. And it really points to this politicized arena and how it makes universities unwilling to go deep and unpack both phenomena in a way that is more deep and engaged, right?
Because as we have mentioned multiple times during this presentation, in conclusion, we recognize that EDI contains holds a certain promise of equality and inclusivity for people of all marginalized backgrounds. Yet in practice, when we specifically focus on Jewish folks and their experience, they are excluded from this otherwise praiseworthy vision that could do a lot of good and positive and much needed work. And while we see that EDI puts a lot of emphasis on the lived experience, again, when it comes to Jewish lived experience, it's omitted. Instead, what we see is concentration on religious discrimination, and this facilitates that omission from lived experiences, classifying, reducing Jewishness as identity to Judaism, where the two, in fact, can overlap, but do not have to. Facilitates omission of Jews that might otherwise seem like create a problem for the existing EDI frameworks, and then it also ignoring that complexity of Jewish difference and of Jewish lived experience, further ignoring the quite possibly growing problem of anti-Semitism in Canadian higher education. As we know, we said that before, anti-Semitism is a shifting phenomenon, changing creature. EDI concentrates on racism, with race being understood as a social construct. Yet Jews are absent from this understanding. Jews are also absent from intersectional understanding of race and races, even though, again, Jewish lived experience runs across religious, cultural practices, ethnic identities, secular identities, you name it, various identity markers. As Lilach has explained, this begins with governmental policies that define minorities. Jews do not count as visible minority. Even when we remove, when we look at, again, just Jewish lived experience, most Canadian Jews also do not self-identify as white, but in the existing omissions of Jewishness in the EDI policies, what we can conclude is that that allows to keep Jews as a missing category, and this leads to unexamined forms of marginalization. Now, this lack of nuance and intersectional approach to Jewishness in this disregard for the lived experience, and the focus on religious identity or religious element of Jewish identity we propose might be a strategic way to avoid discussing Zionism, which presents a challenge for EDI policies and frameworks for several reasons. For example, Zionist Jews feature as colonizers in settler colonial discourses. There would be a question of claims of indigeneity, Jewish indigeneity on the one hand, and then a form of settler colonialism as well as a lens. So this all presents a challenge for Canadian EDI discourses, and it's being omitted. We suggest that maybe this is put aside to avoid further tensions, as Lilach has said, that coupling of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia facilitates this omission and marginalization in the end of both phenomena. So in these current times, both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are subjects of heated debates in academia and beyond. And we acknowledge this is a complex task, but leaving it unaddressed creates unresolved social issues. And we argue also this is also our conclusion, that considering anti-Semitism as a form of racism and not only as a form of religious intolerance would yield much more productive results, including with implications for other groups that are currently omitted, that fall into those gaps in the EDI frameworks, with other groups who do not neatly fit into the existing EDI categories. In the recommendations, we would include. Oh, yeah.
Sorry.
Well, Lilach might want to say something more about Zionism as the elephant in the room.
Sorry.
I wanted to, what I wanted also to say, with regard to this point, that again, this is ignoring. Omitting Zionism is ignoring the lived experience and the self-identification of Canadian Jews who, in some shape or form, feel emotional or otherwise connection to the state of Israel, however it's defined. Yes, maybe to Lilach on that little feature that is noted here.
I would just say, and you can see those two examples here, and both. So one of them featuring Ania and me, we're starring. The second one is just me. But I just want to point out, and I'm sure many of you know, that Zionism became a very loaded term, and it became a way to signal out some people, so to portray them and delegitimize them. And while I think there is absolutely no problem at all to talk very critically about Zionism and anti-Zionism, I think this emotional and underpinning of it, in which you almost need to kind of like come with a flag, and by holding this anti-Zionist or Zionist flag, you are signaling yourself and talking to your audience, make it very hard to engage in deep and nuanced conversation, and in many ways also create these forms of exclusion, right? Because I don't think that, for example, what Ania and I said here falls into this category of whatever, how you put Zionism hat on it, but a pretty similar workshop that we have created, led to see the feedback here, right? So it is a way to target and delegitimize work on anti-Semitism, and to claim that only certain form of work on anti-Semitism, in which again we go to what we pointed out to this policy analysis, in which only if anti-Semitism is very narrowly defined as religious-based discrimination, it is historic, it's in the past, it is this, flaky-ism, only then you can really engage with it in a profound way. And I think this is not enough. This is not good enough to unpack what we see now in our institutions. So recommendation.
Yeah, for recommendations, well, we've started collecting data. We'll continue. We will continue this project by looking into statements that universities have issued about political events in post October and before October, just to see what's out there. We'll just be looking at 3 major Canadian universities for that to give us a glimpse. It will be also in recommendations resulting from the current stage of this research is for universities to also collect their own data and to collect their data on Jewishness and recognize Jewishness beyond merely religious identity, religious affiliation, because when recognize the Jewish difference, Jewish lived experience, without collapsing Jews into the so-called white category, because that prevents us from capturing anti-Semitism as a distinct forms of racism, then we would also recommend that universities, we know already some universities are doing this. Hopefully this will be on a larger scale, review the existing EDI policies and revise them to accommodate those currently occurring instances of discrimination that in this moment affect Jews, but we can imagine different moments, different historical, different political circumstances, and another marginalized minority group would be targeted, and we hope to engage in open conversation, and that research such as us facilitates this open dialogue, open debate that universities stand for. We would also encourage you all to, those of you who would like to get in touch with us, you can please email Lilach. For now, we're finalizing the survey that we would like to, as many as possible, members of Canadian faculty and staff in higher education participate in, to get us a better understanding, give us a better understanding of the experiences of actually living Jews and working in Canadian higher education.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Lilach and Ania. I'll take the priority. I'll take the position